and welcome to this webinar on interventional rounds conducted by WINCAS. Today we are going to cover the transcatheter interventions in case of tetralogy of Fallot. In this webinar, we have eminent speakers, Dr. Vijay Lakshmi ma'am from Bangalore and Dr. K. Shivakumar sir, pediatric cardiologist from Chennai, who will be giving us his experience.
In the continuation, I wanted to say about it. This WINCAS has started doing the webinars on the interventions and as well as the congenital heart diseases for the student purpose. And previously, we had already covered about the TOF clinical presentations, cath meet, and the echocardiographic and evaluation. And today, we are going to talk about the interventions in this tetralogy of the Fallot. Just to give the small introduction about what are the possibilities of interventions in the tetralogy of the Fallot are wide varieties. In the tetralogy of the Fallot, the pre-operatively and the post-operatively, some of the complications can be tackled. Like in the before the surgery itself, when the child has a significant cyanotic spells, RVOT balloon dilatations, and sometimes RVOT stenting, pulmonary wall dilatation, and peripheral pulmonary stenosis causing the significant symptoms, then the balloon dilatation of the pulmonary arteries, and MAPCOS, especially when the subvarieties of the TOF with the pulmonary atresia, where there may be the difficulty during the surgical procedure, so they may request us for the coil closure of this in MAPCOS, and sometimes duct-dependent conditions in the pulmonary atresia conditions, along with the TOF. Then the patency during the infancy of the PDA is very important. Then the PDA ductal stenting, and subsequently, even after the surgery, we may require then a few of the interventions like a residual VSD closures and residual RVOT treatment. A conduit stenosis so causes the dilatation and the stenting, and the contour regurgitations. Pulmonary regurgitation is very frequent following the total repair of the TOF. So again, the pulmonary valve implantations. These are the few of the conditions which we require an intervention. So we are going to discuss in all of them, most of them, not all, along with an examples. So I request now the first Dr. Vijay Lakshmi Madam to start her presentation on the role of catheter-based interventions in tetralogy of the Fallot. Dr. Vijay Lakshmi Madam, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jyotsna. And it's a pleasure to have Shiva on the panel today. And good evening to one and all.
One more request for all the people is, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat. Then don't try to come onto the with the video to put the question. And I request both the presenters are also give us 1 or 2 minutes time after the one case presentation is over, discussion is over, so that we will take the questions of it. Please, madam.
Sure. We have moved from the clinical recognition of congenital heart disease to the intervention. From the time of Frostman, who was thrown out of the cardiology department, this is for the postgraduates, and he became a urologist. And when he got the Nobel Prize, and that time Cournard along with him, he said, the catheter is the key in the lock. And true to that, among the greatest achievements in the cardiovascular medicine in the past century has been the advent of development, refinement, invasive, diagnostic, and therapeutic modalities of cardiac catheterization. And when we come to the tetralogy of Fallot, we have interventions can identify and apply the most effective but least invasive solutions to the most difficult pathologies of tetralogy of Fallot, compared to the traditional surgical options that we had in the past. And today, we can reduce the morbidity and mortality. As Jyotsna has already listed, it's a balloon dilatation of the critical pulmonary stenosis along with the infundibulous stenosis, balloon dilatation of the supravalvular stenosis, and also the peripheral pulmonary artery stenosis, or with or without stenting, balloon dilatation or ductal stenting, balloon dilatation of the blocked BT shunt or thrombolytic therapy there, or coil closure of the MAPCAS if there is hemoptysis post-surgically, catheter perforation of the atretic pulmonary valve, and also followed by surgery if there is a restenosis of pulmonary arteries that can be stented. Now we'll start with the simple balloon dilatation. In patients with tetralogy of Fallot, there is a subset of patients who also have associated valvar stenosis. They are about 25%, especially in the severe form of tetralogy. And here the balloon valvoplasty is also recommended if the patient size or the cardiac anatomy makes the patient unsuitable for any surgical intervention. And in fact, even BT shunt has got a very high mortality compared to the balloon dilatation, which is very, very easy. So here I'm presenting a 3-month-old 4-kilo infant with a saturation of just 56 with the recurrent spells and valvar infundibular stenosis and had one bout of convulsions. So this is a Sims catheter. Why we use Sims catheter? One is it has a bend, and when we pull it back, the tip of the Sims catheter goes towards the RVOT. And once it is towards the RVOT, we can use the floppy guide wire to cross with the torque. The PTCA floppy guide wire is so easy. Without causing even a single ectopic, we can cross the infundibular and the valve very easily. So remember, Sims catheter with the floppy PTCA guide wire to cross and do the balloon. And most often in the very tiny children, we dilate with the PTCA balloon itself. So here the valvar obstruction should be significant, and RVOT, since it is already infundibular stenosis is there is no question of flooding the lungs. In a usual case of pulmonary stenosis where the intact interventricular septum is there, many a times when you open the valve, there will be flash flooding and then pulmonary edema. But that doesn't happen here because there is infundibular stenosis which is protecting. So this is a 3-month-old baby, 4 kilos, cyanotic spell and convulsions. And the saturation was just 42. And then remember, the gradient across the pulmonary valve was so high. And here you can see that it was very, very tight infundibular as well as valvar. So crossed it with the floppy guide wire, initially dilated with the PTCA 3.5 millimeter balloon, but then the Tyshak, mini Tyshak or the bigger balloon could not be negotiated. So this is a trick where you make a loop in the RA. So to make it look like a upper limb approach or like the jugular approach, so there you have you can push the balloon to the place. So the RA, making a loop in the RA gives us a better approach to cross the tight lesion. So here you can go graded from smaller balloon to the bigger balloon. Now pulmonary balloon.
What was the catheter used there? In the second case, what is the catheter?
No, the catheter is regular, your guiding catheters that you use for the PTCA, no? The same guiding catheters.
They are Judkins or Sims? Yeah. It was a Judkins catheter or multi-purpose, or what was it?
No, it is like a RCA, no? So that can be shaped towards the RVOT. So you can, as soon as you enter the RV, just give a clockwise rotation and then it turns towards the RVOT. So it's a guiding catheter. The whole system is PTCA only we use, we are not going to use the adult in this case because these are very tiny children. Any other question?
And what about the access, ma'am? You went through the femoral. Will it go?
Femoral vein, yeah.
If you go through the jugular, do you think the support is more? Because here you had to make a loop and all. So if you go to the jugular, the support will be better?
No. Jugular, we don't use it unless there is a IVC obstruction. Only when there is IVC obstruction or hemiazygous or azygous system is there, that time the jugular approach is used. Otherwise, this is the standard technique where you make a loop in the RA and it appears like upper limb approach. So that is the standard teaching.
What about the support to negotiate on the balloon when the RA through the RA loop?
No,
Coronary balloons may not be the
our
difficult, but you
catheter
said the mini tie shack.
guiding catheter through that PTSA balloon easily goes. And only when you are using, you have to use the Cook's sheath, where you have to go 6 French or 7 French. And that can easily go through that. Shiva wants to add something?
Ma'am, I think you can proceed, ma'am.
Okay. So pulmonary balloon valvuloplasty may not be successful in some patients. It is not possible in all the patients. Very rarely severe hypoxic sick infants with very, very low saturations. These are the ones where we attempt. And when we attempt to cross the infundibulum can precipitate cyanotic spell, and mortality is reported and tamponade is reported in the literature. But however, in my experience, I have never had this problem because I always use the SIMS catheter and the PTCA floppy guide wire, and everything according to the how you do for the PTCA. The guiding catheter as well as the balloons are PTCA. And this is the 5 months old baby, 3.9 kilos, presented with excessive cry, cyanotic spells, saturation was 66. And the echo showed the RP and LP were also very, very small. And after balloon valvuloplasty, the child gained it became 6.4 kilos. And then saturation was 84. And then the LPA and RP also grew. So this is the advantage of doing the balloon dilatation, because once the antegrade flow is allowed, the pulmonary tree grows. And that doesn't happen when the BT shunt is done. And that's why this is more natural compared to the BT shunt. And once the BT shunt is done, redo surgery becomes difficult because of the fibrosis and adhesions. So that case I was telling you, this is the first angio where you can see that how the infundibular valvar stenosis is there. And after 4 months, you can see that the pulmonary tree has grown once the balloon dilatation was done with the mini tie shack 5x20. And you can see that once the pulmonary tree is grown, the Magoon index and everything improves, and the child can be easily taken for surgery. And by then the weight also would have gained.
One more advantage mentioned for this valvular dilatation is, in addition to the pulmonary vascular tree growth, reduces the need for the transannular patching. Is also noted.
Yes. The annulus also grows.
Yeah.
The annulus, pulmonary tree, and the branches, all of them, they grow. Yeah.
And do you select the balloon size on echo basis, or do you go for any imaging before you select
the balloon? Unlike the regular pulmonary stenosis that you do where you take 100, 120 times, here, no. We go with depending on the smallest balloon, 2.5 millimeter. You can just see here that, this is the PTCA 2 millimeter balloon. So we are going with the smaller balloon and then go with the bigger. See, this is 2 millimeters, then 3.5. So graded you go, It is not the annulus, it is not the size. We go with the smaller because it is so tight, you cannot push the bigger balloons at all. So you have to make the access. So this is a 3-month-old baby where you can see that at multiple levels there are obstruction, RVOT, valvar, and also supravalvar stenosis is there. So first I started with the 3 millimeter balloon, and then went with the 5 millimeter and then 7 millimeter balloon. So this is how, you can go, even the renal artery balloon you have, even that can be used in small children. So this is how you go graded with the 2.5, 2, 3, and then 7 millimeters. So what are the advantages, as Jyotsna has already told? The various studies have shown that substantial increase in saturation occurs. So that reduces the number of cells as well as the damage to the brain cells, which is very important. So even if the surgeon makes the surgery later on, if the brain is damaged, IQ comes down, we are not doing a good job. And apart from that, there is a growth of pulmonary valve annulus. And because of the annulus, the during the surgery, requirement of the annular patch also comes down. And then the need for the transannular patch is reduced by 40%. So that is a very significant, The transannular patch is the cause for the pulmonary regurgitation, and that comes down by 40%. And that's a huge advantage. And the risk of intracardiac repair is postponed in the infant. And in our country, managing the post-operatively in an infant is very difficult. But if the child is operated at the age of 6 months or 9 months, it is much easier for the nurses to manage in the post-op management. And apart from that, with the balloon valvoplasty in tetralogy, it acts like a safe bridge to surgery. So the child is prepared for the surgery later on without any scar. Any questions?
No, please go ahead, madam.
Okay. So this is only a 6 weeks baby weighing 3.2 kilos.
Yeah, one more. Just now, the one question has come.
Okay.
The cutting balloon subpulmonic RVOT dilatation is asked by Dr. Tripti Dev.
Tripti, we don't use the cutting balloons at all in children. Cutting balloons are used only for peripheral pulmonary artery stenosis or like aortoarthritis where they are very thick and fibrotic. And here it is so tender, we don't use the cutting balloon, Tripti.
And one more thing is whenever while passing the wire and the balloon and everything, the spasm can be precipitated. As you already said that the cyanotics help in precipitated. So it should be a softer balloon than the very soft.
Yeah, PTCA balloons are the best. I don't use anything other than PTCA balloons, which are very malleable and very easily. And that too, you must take a new balloon, not the Oxford.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, madam.
Yes, ma'am, you can proceed.
Okay. So this child had a PDA with left to right shunt, 3 millimeter. RP was 4 millimeters. And the RVOT gradient was 72. RV pressure was 80. And then we dilated with the 5/20 Ty-Shak balloon and saturation improved considerably. This is little bigger. You can see here that this Sims catheter, when you pull it down, it points towards the RVOT so beautifully. And through that, the floppy guide wire very easily goes. You have a torque and just go on moving it. Can you see that? How easily it passes?
Yes, ma'am.
And over that, passing a PTCA balloon is not a problem. Once the PTCA balloon makes the way, and then we can go with the mini Ty-Shak balloon and dilate. And you see that this is the patient. And after 1 year, the pulmonary has grown so well. I'm sorry, this is not playing. Okay. And here you can see that how pulmonary tree has grown. Fortunately, the child also had a tortuous PDA, which was diagnosed earlier. And we also did balloon dilatation. So this was acting like a BT shunt, and our balloon dilatation allowed the pulmonary annulus to grow. So you can see that how the pulmonary annulus has grown here. So in our series, almost 50% of the children could be taken up for surgery within 1 month after balloon dilatation because saturation had improved, the convulsions had come down, and they were in a better position. And after 6 months, almost 20% were operated. And no surgery was done till the follow-up in about 30%. And you can see that the Magnus index, the annulus improved a lot, and Z-score also improved considerably after the balloon dilatation. So now we have CT, MRI, and whatnot for knowing not only the infundibular valvular stenosis and even peripheral. The peripheral pulmonary artery stenosis are better seen in the CT angio rather than our angio. Now, this is the angio. You can clearly see that there is an infundibulous stenosis, and you can see that the negative shadow here is because of the dysplastic thickened pulmonary valve, and there is a discrete supravalvular stenosis. So when there is a discrete supravalvular stenosis, now a few decades ago we were taught not to dilate the main pulmonary artery, but today if there is a discrete supravalvular stenosis, that also can be dilated with the balloon. And here the balloon has to be taken not with the size of what you have the post-stenotic dilatation. It has to be smaller, almost the size of the annulus or smaller than the annulus. So immediate surgical intervention can be avoided in such cases. Can you see that? How the supravalvular stenosis is so discrete. It is very nicely seen and dilated.
What about the slippage of the balloons when you are dilating it?
No, usually they are so tight, it doesn't slip. One go, it just dilates. Okay, now we'll move on to the RVOT stenting from the balloon dilatation. The RVOT stenting helps to overcome the critical strain. This is very sick children with the very tight infundibulous stenosis and rise the systolic pressure in the pulmonary artery, improve the blood saturation, and evade the emergency shunt surgery. Because otherwise, left alone, these children require the BT shunt as an emergency. And the stent implantation provides an effective alternative to palliative surgical enlargement of the right ventricular infundibulum. So here the hypoxic spells can be avoided. Now you can see in the X-ray, there is a right-sided aortic arch. There is a total oligemia. You can see that hardly there is any flow. That is because I have freezed the frame so that people can make out. This is the infundibular portion. It is so tight. And this is valvar. You can see that it is a pinpoint. Can you see that? It's almost pinpoint valvar. So now in one go, you can dilate both by putting a stent. So you have to do in the AP view as well as the lateral view. And you can see that sometimes even the pulmonary valve can be included in that. Otherwise, you can take from here till here the stent. And that's what I have done. And this is how you get an excellent result.
There is a question, can the multi-purpose catheter also can be used?
Yes, you can.
And what is the maximum size of the balloons?
But only what happens is when you use the multi-purpose catheter, your floppy guide wire can go through the side hole, And that's why whether it is for coil closure or balloon dilatation, we use only the end hole catheter and not the multi-purpose.
And what is the maximum size of the balloon can be used?
No, we don't oversize like the regular pulmonary stenosis. Regular pulmonary stenosis, you go to 100 to 120 times. But here, we always undersize. If the annulus is 6, we take 5. So 1 millimeter less than that. Now you see here, this is the angio with the very tight infundibular stenosis. Can you see that? And this child was presented with the hypoxic spells as well as convulsions. So we had to do the stenting. Though stenting appears the thing, we have to be very careful with the stent that we use because in this infancy, the angle between the RVOT and the RV is so acute. And in this acute angle, negotiating the stent becomes very difficult. And that too through the thread-like, very, very tight infundibular stenosis. And unlike other conditions, where the arteries are dilated, pre-dilated, and then put the stent, and here pre-dilatation of the infundibular stenosis is going to make the spasm worse. So we cannot. So here you can see that it was very difficult to pass this stent initially. So then what happened was when we pushed, the balloon went ahead and the stent remained backward. So we slightly inflated the balloon at the tip, and along with the balloon, the stent was pulled to the sheath. But unfortunately, there is a flaring of the struts here. So at that time, what you have to do is take a snare and go up on the top and push the guide wire into that. And see there, this is how you go up and then push the guide wire through the snare. And once you know that your guide wire is caught well, confirm it whether the guide wire is within it or not by closing the snare once. And then once you are sure, now you can see that the guide wire is very much inside. I'm pulling the guide wire. Now again, open the stent. Your snare,
Retriever.
and bring it along the stent down to the tip. And once you come to the tip, hold the tip. The flared up tips are held tightly so that they all come into the sheath together. Now you see there, I'm showing you how to come. The snare has to bring it down where until the snared portion. This is the flared up portion. Once you come to the flared up portion, you hold it tightly. And once you hold it tightly, it can be easily removed. So in this patient, that was a longer stent and it was a stiffer one. So next you can see that I was telling you how the RVOT angio has to be done with the tiny hand injection. You can see that this is the infundibulum, and this gives us an idea how much stent has to be taken and how long it has to be and where it has to be positioned. So keep this as a roadmap and then introduce the stent and dilate it. And you can see here that how tight the stenosis of the infundibular, and ultimately we succeeded. You can see here how it was done in the same patient, and then later on the child went for surgery. So this is how the post-stenting angio is seen. There is a good flow into that, and that pinpoint thread-like infundibular stenosis is overcome. Any question?
Yeah, actually,
Now,
there is
when
one.
do you decide to go for balloon or to go for stunting?
See, balloon dilatation in a subset of patients, only hardly 25% of them. On the echo, you see the valvar stenosis also. You get the double thing when you take the Doppler signals, one for the infundibular and another for the valvar. So when you have valvar associated stenosis, you go for the balloon. But if there is a thread, like I showed you the previous case, in this case, there is no other go but to do the dilatation. See, when it is like this, your balloon itself may not go through this. So in such a situation, when the child is very sick and hypoxemia is there, you have to go for the stenting.
Some suggestion that the two PTCA balloons side by side may improve the results, but actually there is a triple balloon technique, but most of these things are for the pulmonary valve isolated stenosis. I don't know whether it can be used in this where the infundibulum is already the spasm. So I think it's better not to handle with that. That's what I feel.
In fact, minimum maneuvering in the RVOT, bare minimum. Just push the Sims catheter, pull it so that it points towards the RVOT. Take the floppy guide wire very carefully with the torque. Just like threading the needle, you go without causing a single ectopic. You're not.
And what are the stunts used here? What type of stunts are used for the RVOT?
Coronary stent. Okay, now we go, or even peripheral stent, the short ones can be used.
If the size is large, you can go for a peripheral stent.
Yes.
4 and above. Okay.
Yes. Now we move on to the LPS stenosis, and the most often in children, just balloon dilatation is adequate to open up the stenosis. And why the balloon dilatation has to be done before the surgery is, otherwise post-operatively their the time taken in the post-op is very high and they don't come out of the ventilation. And that's the reason the pulmonary artery balloons dilatation has to be done prior to the surgery. And suppose there are two things, as already suggested, you can keep two guide wires in two places and you can keep two balloons, and with the kissing technique, you can open both together. So that, there is no, like a slipping of the balloon or anything. But it cannot be done in the infundibulum or the valvar. So this is a different set of patients where there is a peripheral pulmonary artery stenosis, not the infundibulum is not tight. So when the infundibulum is very tight, RVOT stenting. When there is a pulmonary valvar stenosis, balloon dilatation. When there is a peripheral pulmonary artery stenosis, you can do balloon dilatation as well as the stenting. And here, the recommendations have to be followed. The indication for treatment with the peripheral pulmonary artery stenosis, class 1 indication. Class 2A is indicated for significant distal arterial stenosis in the larger or more proximal branches. So if the RPA at the primary or the secondary branching, there are stenosis, we can open them. And if there is a significant main pulmonary artery stenosis, that results in an elevation of the pressure to more than 2/3 of the systemic pressure in the proximal pulmonary artery, and that segment also has to be dilated. Now, these recommendations, all of you can read, so I will go to the case scenario. Okay, so this is the post-surgical patient, came with the tight pulmonary artery stenosis. The child was 7 years old, and the gradient was 48 by 22 millimeters of mercury. And that is quite a severe stenosis. So here you can keep one guide wire in one branch and another in another, so that, you take a long sheath right up to the stenosis, so that your balloon and the stenting can be kept properly. So you can see here how tight the stenosis is. It is almost very difficult. And here, instead of floppy, you use the regular, your J-tipped guide wire. Otherwise, your balloon and stent will not go. So very small infants, 3 kilos, 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks children, you go with the floppy guide wire. But here, post-operative, bigger children, the 7 years old child, here you put the J guide wire, and that too a stiffer one. And then you dilate. So you can see that how the LPA stenosis is post-operative dilatation is done. So these are the markers pins, and these are the suture one. Now you can see that the post-stenting angio shows that good opening of the LPA stenosis. But when there are multiple stenosis like this, invariably like Alagille syndrome associated, it's very difficult. So one by one, you have to go on tackling each one of them and dilate all of them. Now, any questions? Otherwise, we'll move on to the intervention in the BT shunt.
Yes, ma'am. You can proceed.
Okay. Here, the BT shunt is done to buy some time for the intracardiac repair. But on the contrary, the BT shunt come with the blocked. So clinically, if you hear a continuous murmur, the BT shunt is functioning. If the child has become very sick, cyanotic, and the continuous murmur is not heard, that means the BT shunt is blocked or narrowed. So here, when the Blalock tossing shunt is blocked, we can do the balloon dilatation. If we are suspecting thrombosis, we can keep the catheter and give the thrombolytic therapy there, or you can stent inside the BT shunt itself. So BT shunt is usually 4 millimeters, and then you have to give a 4 millimeter or 5 millimeter stent can be used to do that. So I will show you how it has to be done. Now you go into the artery and then give the injection to see the stump. Now, this is the stump. Like how the total occlusion coronary arteries you cross, in the same way, you can use the whisper guide wire or a little shinobi guide wire or any of them to cross this and give a shape so that it bends down and comes down. So once you come down, you put your balloon and then dilate it.
What about the distal embolization? Because it's a thrombotic burden is quite significant.
You can't help, no? The child is sick and cyanotic and this thing. So even if it embolizes, it goes into the pulmonary artery, and that will be very tiny. And after all, BT shunt is just 4 millimeter. So thrombolytic therapy, it will get pulverized and go into the periphery. So this is not a systemic embolization. It's going to happen in the pulmonary artery, and there it will get filtered. So here you can see that the stenting of the BT shunt has been done successfully, and then you get some time for the child to grow and then take up for the surgery. And this is the rare complication of the BT shunt, and either the child will overgrow the BT shunt or it will be thrombosed, one of the two things. So the BT shunt is good in 65% of the patients, but satisfactory in 31% of the cases and unsatisfactory in 3% of the cases. So the stenosed BT shunt, opening it is extremely good. And at least though it is not 100%, we can succeed in almost a large chunk of patients.
You are mentioning about the stenting of the BT shunt after the balloon dilatation if it is required. That time the stent will be the covering the proximal and the distal anastomotic sites.
Yeah.
Shunt also.
No. You take, see here, exactly. You see you take once you open with the balloon, you know the length of it, and then part of the stent is in the pulmonary artery and part of it is here. So you cover the whole BT shunt.
No, the major problem in the acute closures of the BT shunts is the surgical problem.
Correct.
Like the anastomotic sites abnormalities, which is responsible.
Correct.
So again, we are not covering that area. May have the
correct. That's why your stent has to be partially, positioned into the pulmonary artery and part of it above, so that no stenotic portion is left. And usually it is at the suture place where the stenosis occurs. And once the stenosis occurs, there is a stagnation of the blood and the thrombosis. So you have to tackle the thrombosis as well as the stenosis.
There is a question on palliative PDA stents and size and types.
We are going to come to that, no?
Okay. And there is they wanted to again explain the double balloon technique for RPS stenosis, like a bifurcation. We are doing the bifurcation of the coronaries. The same way it can be.
You have to have two abscesses, and then you cross both, and then you keep two balloons, and simultaneously your assistant, the postgraduate, or yourself, or the nurse, you hold the position properly, and your assistants will inflate simultaneously. Like you say 1, 2, 3, and go, and they dilate with the indiflator. Now we move on to the PDA stenting. When blood flow to the RV to PA is significantly reduced and the blood supply to the lung depends on patency. So this is a duct dependent cases, and within 48 hours to 21 days when the duct starts closing and the child becomes very sick. So this is how you keep the thing and then stent the duct. And I will show you the case example. This is the neonate, 3.4 kilos, diagnosed as meconium aspiration syndrome because there was a respiratory distress, because the neonatologist did not imagine that there could be anything other than that, because the echo was not done in the fetus as well as neonatally, and treated in the NICU on ventilation. And as the child recovered, they discharged. And on the 9th day, the child came back within 24 hours. Remember, when you make a wrong diagnosis and the wrong treatment, the child is going to come back. And here the mistake was the fetal echo was not done. And then before discharging, the echo ought to have been done, which was not done. So then the patient came back with the respiratory distress again with the severe cyanosis, was put on ventilation again within 24 hours. And then we knew it was a pulmonary atresia. This angio I have shown here. On the 10th day, I did the angio. You can see that the ventilation, the endotracheal tube is there. And with the ventilation, we did. And then RV was so small, hypoplastic, and the coronaries were filling through the sinusites, and the blood was going into the aorta because of the VST. So what I did was went to the duct, and then here you must see that a prostacyclin that you are giving, it has to be stopped few hours before the stenting. And that has to be managed in such a way that the duct doesn't close at the same time, it is not flared up. Otherwise, what happens, the moment you release the stent, and the stent jumps into the pulmonary artery. So here you have to balance between the two, and then the duct stenting was done successfully, and you can see that the pulmonary arteries are well visualized. And then because the child also had very hypoplastic RV, I did the balloon dilatation of the IAS also.
What about usually the PDA in a talk is vertical PDAs. So it may not be a simple PDAs to cross and do it. So there is a different types of the PDAs. Sometimes it's taking organ for the other areas. So what are the modifications you require to cannulate them, either root or the catheter?
No, whatever it is, it is a very risky thing. You can see here how the duct is coming. It is not thing, it's almost vertical, and that too negotiating your stent. You can literally see that the stent is vertical. Okay. So one has to be very, 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 very careful with the stenting of the duct. Because one, it should not close at the same time. And your stent that you use are the coronary stent, and very malleable you have to use, which can be easily negotiated, not the stiff ones.
I think this type of the PDAs has to be demonstrated by the CT angio before taking, so that you will know which route to be taken, like an axillary or a carotid. Because if it is so vertical and then ascending from the arch of the aorta, it is taking origin. Probably it may not be possible to do through the femoral route.
Absolutely right. You are absolutely right. This is a difficult thing, and some of the pediatric cardiologists have specialized in BT shunting, like Dr. Alvi in Malaysia. And now we move on to the mechanical perforation.
There is the question the post-stunting. Do you increase the dose of aspirin in these patients or add a warfarin post-stunting?
Yeah, aspirin is given like any other thing. But here, saving the child is important. Once the stent and the child saturation improves and then grows, and then we can think of that. Aspirin is given in the regular dose.
Madam, can we cut short a little bit about this mechanical perforation, because we have a more extensive discussion by
Now here I'm showing you, it's a very tight thing, but echo showed that there was a confluent pulmonary arteries, and you can see that I have kept two guide wires. One is the floppy guide wire to see where the tip is, and other one is the whisper guide wire, which is to perforate that. So once you perforate that, the thin membrane, and then through the PDA, it has gone into the descending aorta. So this is only a 20-day-old baby with the pulmonary atresia. And since there is a confluent pulmonary artery, we can do this. And so I'll move to the next one. This is a 6-year-old child came with a brain abscess, and the neurosurgeon referred to me for the fitness for surgery. And when I did echo, I found that there was a confluent pulmonary arteries, the native pulmonary artery, you can see here, but it was atretic. And hardly there was a 1 or 2 millimeter distance between the RVOT and the pulmonary artery. So I said, I requested them, give me a chance, let me try. I'm not sure, but I'll try. So the saturation was 55 and the patient had a brain abscess, and the patient was referred from West Bengal. And you can see here that, you can see here that when angio is done, hardly there is any flow, and the main pulmonary arteries are filling through the collaterals. So what I did was, with the floppy guide wire, I crossed the lesion with the Shinobi by the side, and this is only 2 millimeter PTCA balloon. And once the 2 millimeter PTCA balloon, I succeeded, and then went with the 6 millimeter Ty-Shak balloon. So
what about the radio frequency ablation and then doing the procedure? That is radio frequency ablation to do the perforation and then putting.
No, that I'm going to come to the next.
Okay.
I'm showing you where there is a thin membrane. You can perforate with the PTCA, the other end, hard end. And there you have to be very careful. So instead of the hard end, what I use is the Whisper guide wire or the Shinobi guide wire. So Shinobi guide wire can perforate this very tiny one. And here it was done with the Shinobi guide wire. And you can see that in spite of making the way with the PTCA balloon, how tight the stenosis is. And this child did very well and underwent surgery. So this is the laser thing. P.S. Rao, who was a co-author or editor of my book on congenital heart disease, comprehensive approach. He is the one who came out with this publication in 1992. The pulmonary atresia, the perforation can be done. The theoretical part I'll quickly leave. And this is how the diagram it is given. And with this Bailey's radio frequency ablation, you can perforate and then dilate with the balloon. So I'm showing the case here, the angio. The end you can make out, here it is. Once you know where exactly, here you have to have a biplane lab, or you have to have a multi-views before you ablate. And unless you are very sure about the anatomy, ablation cannot be done. So this perforation, I'll quickly move on as the time is short. And this is Fontan in the triple M. And this is the post-surgical. Invariably, after surgery, the collaterals, they disappear or they come down in size. So invariably, we don't coil unless the surgeons request us to coil before. But post-surgically, this patient had hypertension because of the massive hemoptysis. So I had to go on identifying each one of them and coil. So almost 5 or 6 coils I used to coil each one of them, and the patient stabilized and improved. So to conclude, friends, the precision is the key. You have to be very accurate. Balloon pulmonary valvular stenosis, stenting of RVOT in tetralogy is safe and effective, promotes growth of annulus as well as the pulmonary tree. Complicated cases like pulmonary atresia or hypoplastic pulmonary valve or pulmonary artery, collaterals can benefit from series of interventions prior to surgery. Transcatheter interventions have revolutionized the treatment of tetralogy of Fallot, improve the chances of full recovery in most of the cases with the least morbidity and mortality. And this is where I was showing the live case in Alvis Place in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur. And at that time, neither the Chinese nor the Japanese were doing the device closures, or they were as advanced as we in India. And then, everybody was attracted. And remember, whenever something is very attractive, you tend to lose your, the concentration, and that should not happen. And this is Dr. King, and this is Mullins, and this is Mike Tynan, who is the along with Shakil Qureshi, has come with the Ty-Shak balloon. Ty is Tynan and Shak is Shakil Qureshi. And thank you very much for your kind and patient hearing.
Thank you very much, madam. If there are any further questions on this presentation, I will forward to you. Please give the answers so that we can put it in our either students' corner or in the academic WhatsApp. May I request now Dr. Shivakumar to go to his presentation.
Sure. In fact, Dr. Jyotsna has given me a small additional agenda on interventions in top. So, a very brief overlap on neonatal tetralogy. Tetralogy very often will have some amount of antegrade flows that they are usually unlikely to present with severe neonatal cyanosis. However, top pulmonary atresia may present with duct-dependent circulation. And ductal stent, as Madam has pointed out, is one option which is an alternative for BT-shunt. And it is important to notice how is the ductal morphology in order to plan the procedure. So the ducts can be the routine fashion ductus. It is very unusual in tetralogy. Most of the tetralogy ducts will be either vertical or tortuous from the undersurface of the aorta. And in almost about 20% of the patients, it will be from the contralateral aortic arch. That means it is the right aortic arch with a left-sided PDA or a left aortic arch with a right-sided PDA. Extremely rarely, you can have bilateral ductus with non-confluent pulmonary artery. So we need to identify them. Fortunately, a lot of us are able to identify these details on echocardiography itself, that it's not a common procedure for a newborn to go for an advanced CT imaging prior to ductal stenting. The vertical tortuous duct is the commonest type. And on a suprasternal view, you can appreciate the aortic arch with a S-shaped bend of the suprasternal, the tortuous ductus. And once such a tortuosity is identified, the whole planning is made about how to proceed further. One of the method is to pursue from the femoral artery itself by using what is called as a cut pigtail and passing a guide wire. A cut pigtail will have a J-like shape which will engage this ductus. And after passing one of the guide wire, if you take a second guide wire which is called as a buddy wire, then this gives added stability that most of the cases, even a extremely vertical and tortuous duct can be straightened out and we can advance a stent. However, there are going to be a small number of situations where you may not be able to achieve just by a panel. This is again a cut pigtail. However, a stable guide wire position sometimes may not be achieved with a tortuous ductus, and in such cases, axillary artery approach may have to be taken. In fact, Madam showed one example of a carotid artery approach. I have not ventured into carotid artery approach so far. The reason being, like a little bit of concerns about thrombus on the carotid artery, which may progress in future, and whether it needs to be percutaneous or whether it needs to be by a surgical cut down. There are data that are available from certain veteran operators, like, for example, a recent publication in Circulation from Henry Justino from the Texas Heart Institute. They have shown in about 52 cases a safe carotid artery percutaneous puncture and a manual compression. However, in 4 of the patients on a meticulous ultrasound examination, they identified thrombus, and in one of the patients, there was a pericarotid hematoma. All of them were sorted out with conservative management. In the former, where there is thrombus with heparin, and where there was a hematoma with like a small evacuation of the hematoma. However, I'm a little bit concerned about putting a catheter through the carotid. And so my second option will be through the axillary artery. Here you can appreciate an axillary approach. Very often an axillary catheter with the Judkins right coronary artery catheter will get angulated towards the mouth of the ductus, that we will be able to advance the guide wire. A contralateral ductus is seen in almost about 20% of cases of pulmonary atresia. What do we mean by contralateral duct? A right aortic arch with the left-sided ductus that is either coming out from the innominate artery or left subclavian artery. And in such cases, it is hooked initially with the Judkins right catheter, and then subsequently we advance a 4 French long hook sheath to the mouth of the ductus, and the stenting is done in the standard manner. So this is a contralateral duct, and after stenting it, if there is a remaining portion of the ductus that is left open, this also is covered with an additional stent in order to prevent a stenosis of this ductus in future. The general dictum about ductal stenting is we need to stent the entire length of the ductus. Number 2, it has to be followed by preferably dual antiplatelet agents, because chances of ductal stent thrombosis causing acute hypoxic insults are quite common. And so it is better to be aggressive on antiplatelet therapy. Very, very rarely ductus can be bilateral, and in these cases pulmonary arteries are non-confluent. So this is an example of a left aortic arch. There is the left-sided ductus which is coming from the undersurface, a vertical duct that is coursing towards the left pulmonary artery, and you can appreciate the right-sided ductus is coming from the right innominate artery. So each ductus is wired independently. So this is a left duct being wired independently and a right duct being wired separately. In these cases, we need to go for slightly smaller stents in order to avoid pulmonary overcirculation. The question about whether you have to use a bare metal stent versus a drug-eluting stent in a newborn baby. The concern is whenever there is a drug-eluting stent, the toxicity of the drug, which can either be sirolimus, zetralimus, or everolimus, or paclitaxel, what is going to be the impact on the newborn baby? There was initially a study by Lee Benson in Canada who showed that the drug levels are quite high in the first 3 weeks when they used a Cypher Select, the first generation stent. However, that was not associated with any clinical impact. The second study came from Athar Qureshi from again Texas children, where they used a second generation drug-eluting stent, and they found that there was no significant clinical toxicity. We recently published our results on third generation drug-eluting stent, which is our BioMine stent from India, which is a sirolimus eluting stent, and we found that the drug levels come to normalcy, that means less than immunosuppressive levels, within the first 7 days, especially if you are using a stent that is smaller than 22 millimeters. So why do we need a drug-eluting stent? This is a bare metal stent that has been put in, and within 2 months, there is an intense instant restenosis, significant growth within the stent, and so the child is presenting with severe hypoxia. The child has not grown big enough for a corrective surgery and still remains small at around 2.5 kilograms. So in such case, we may have to wire the stenosed ductus and advance another stent, and this time it is a drug-eluting stent, within a bare metal stent, and that is again recanalizing the stent which has got a severe instant restenosis. Madam already covered on interventions on
few questions we have it on the PDA stenting, sir.
Yes,
most of the time, sometimes the PDA in the tetralogy of the fallow can be associated with the aortic arch abnormalities, especially when there is a 22q11 deletion. So, do you see the imaging before the PDA stenting about
that? Good point. The basic common problems of a 22q deletion related aortic arch abnormalities, in the commonest presentation is it's a right aortic arch, and sometimes if the innominate artery, the subclavian will have a cervical origin of the subclavian artery. In the tetralogy with pulmonary atresia, commonest type of ductus, almost in 75% of the patients, it will be a vertical tortuous ductus from the undersurface of the aortic arch itself, wherein an imaging is really not necessary. However, if the patient is having a ductus from the contralateral aortic arch, and in those contralateral aortic arch, that means a right-sided aortic arch with a left-sided ductus, or left-sided aortic arch with a right-sided duct, and in such a case, if there is a subclavian artery which is arising far more superiorly from the cervical level, then this can create a problem for cannulating the ductus. However, it is reasonably easier to image them by echocardiography. Having said that, it is in Western world, it is a very common practice for a neonatal CT aortogram to be performed on every patient before a ductal stent today. However, in India, still we have not seen that as a very routine policy. Not every newborn gets a CT scan. We are reasonably happy if we find the ductus from the undersurface of the aortic arch well seen on a suprasternal view of the echocardiogram. We just take up the patient into the cath lab rather than subjecting them for an additional CT imaging. But I was listening to your comment when Madam Vijayalakshmi was talking. it is not a bad idea to have a CT scan, especially if you are planning some unusual access, like for example a carotid access and all, to plan which carotid you will be planning to puncture and what is the angulation. So if you are going quite aggressive on the ductal stent with non-femoral access, it may be acceptable to go for a CT imaging. It has not been my practice to use a CT in any of the patients so far.
About the PDA tortuosities, it is already it's a simple classification of type 1, type 2, type 3, depending upon the multiple turn, single turn, or the relatively straight one, is a well acceptable one. But origin, depending upon the origin, the PDA taking origin for the descending aorta, undersurface of the arch, which is a common, as you already said, innominated subclavian or ascending aortas. Have you seen the PDAs from the ascending aortas?
No, actually there is a technical difference between the definition of what is called as a PDA. A PDA should arise beyond the first arch branch. If it is arising from the ascending aorta, then it gets named differently. It's called as aortic origin of branch pulmonary artery. The ductus has to arise from the arch, and the arch by definition starts from the first arch branch. So if you are having a left aortic arch, the ductus has to be any point beyond the right innominate artery. If it is proximal to the right innominate artery, then the entire name is different. Previously, it used to be called as hemitruncus arteriosus. However, the nomenclature classifications given by the Annals of Thoracic Surgery in 1991, they stopped the term hemitruncus arteriosus and they renamed it as aortic origin of right pulmonary artery or left pulmonary artery. In such cases, the difference between ductus arteriosus and the direct aortic origin of the branch pulmonary arteries, the direct origin of ascending aortic origin of branch pulmonary arteries are commonly associated with unilateral hypertension of the pulmonary artery, and they rarely have stenosis. So these are patients where we will be doing the other type of treatment. There are some occasional patients where there is a tetralogy of Fallot with an ascending aorta giving off the right or left pulmonary artery, which one side is significantly hypertensive. In such cases, rarely you may have to go and do an unilateral pulmonary artery banding to protect those pulmonary arteries so that they can later be recruited back into the main pulmonary artery circulation. It is the ductus that has got a tendency to narrow, and if there is an ascending aortic origin of branch pulmonary arteries, they don't have a tendency to narrow. They keep enlarging with the growth of the child, and they cause unilateral pulmonary arterial hypertension, and very quickly within 1 year or so they will lead to pulmonary vascular disease on that particular one.
About this ductal spasm, it is mentioned as one of the complications even during the wiring also. Exactly. So do you encounter that, or really the prostaglandins are stopped before mainly to produce some constriction so that the stent can be hold very well? So, but exactly. Once the spasm occurs, again probably we have to shift back to give the prostaglandins. So how frequent it is an encounter?
Yes, actually the ductal spasm to be the pros and cons of stopping the prostaglandin earlier versus continuing the prostaglandin till the last minute. If the ductus is a straight ductus from the descending thoracic aorta, as in a normal PDA, such patients, wiring of the PDA is going to be quite easier, and hence in these patients, it is a common practice to stop the ductus very early, almost 3 to 4 hours earlier, and allow for the saturations to drop down to low 80s before you take up the patient into the cath lab. Keep on observing the patient in the ICU till the saturation drops, and then take up the patient into the cath lab. However, if it is a vertical and tortuous ductus, you can allow the prostaglandin till the last minute. The advantage of having a vertical and a tortuous PDA, the chances of a stent embolization into the branch pulmonary artery is extremely less likely in a tortuous PDA. The tortuosity itself holds the entire ductal stent in place. So the general rules that are followed for stopping the prostaglandin, if it is a usual PDA from the descending thoracic aorta, or if it is a PDA from the innominate artery, the prostaglandin is stopped 3 to 4 hours earlier. Wait till the saturation drops down to low 80s or early 70s, and then move the patient into the cath lab. Don't remove the prostaglandin infusion from the venous line. You just stop the infusion pump. and move the child with the infusion pump inside. At any point of time, if there is a clinical desaturation and the ductal spasm is very, very significant in the cath lab, you always have an option of restarting the prostaglandin. Whereas if it is a vertical and tortuous ductus, keep running the prostaglandin even while you are taking the vascular access. The vertical, extremely tortuous PDS, you allow the prostin to keep running. A straight ductus, you stop the prostin well in advance.
There is a question on after the PDS stunting, the surgical correction. Is there it interferes?
Very often, the ductal stent will be protruding.
So there is some concern regarding the branched pulmonary artery stenosis, especially the LPA.
Exactly.
And the deferred growth of the pulmonary artery after the stunting because of jailing by the stent.
Yes. So the first issue that happens quite often is the stent protrudes into the branch pulmonary arteries in the region of the confluence to produce a significant confluence narrowing. While the branch pulmonary arteries, the hilar level may be grown adequately, the place where the stent is protruding into the confluence will be narrowed. And in such cases, the surgeon should be prepared to do an extensive pericardial patchplasty of the confluence. Now, the second issue that you are talking about, sometimes the ductal stent may protrude too much towards one of the branch pulmonary artery, leading to selective perfusion of one of the pulmonary artery, and the other pulmonary artery which gets jailed off may not get a perfusion at all. And if you notice it reasonably early in your follow-up echocardiogram at second or third month, in such a case, a CT scan is done and the CT confirms that there is a significant hypoperfusion of one of the side which is jailed. It is better to go for a thoracotomy on that side, put in a BT shunt on that hypoplastic pulmonary artery so that also grows bigger. And then at a total correction, you will be able to address the ductal stent as well as the BT shunt together. We did an analysis of our patients when we did a ductal stenting. We found that almost invariably, close to 80% of the patients will have significant stenosis at the level of the entry point of the ductus into the pulmonary artery. But fortunately, it will be at the level of confluence where the surgeon can easily enlarge it with a pericardial patch. In about 20% of the patients, there is a selective hyperperfusion of one of the sides and jailing of the contralateral side. And if the jailing was extremely severe, that there was a very poor perfusion on one of the pulmonary arteries. Usually, these pulmonary arteries don't grow beyond 3 to 4 millimeters. They remain at the same size as the neonatal period. And we often try to do a modified BT shunt through a thoracotomy on these patients without touching the ductal stent, leaving the ductal stent as such to allow it to continue to flow. But through a thoracotomy, put in a shunt into the hilar pulmonary artery and then address them about 6 months later when both the pulmonary arteries are grown.
You are already mentioned about the BMS versus DES, but I was reading another article where they used a bioabsorbable stents because most of them takes about 6 to 9 months or sometimes to 1 year. So by the time the corrective surgery can be done.
Yes, actually the bioabsorbable stent, the original absorbed stent which was made up of PLLA has never been tried in the ductus. The reason being, it was an extremely large profile stent and the stent lost its clinical applicability quite early in coronary practice itself. However, there is a substantial work that is being done currently on iron stents. It's basically molecular iron a stent made by LifeTech, and these iron stents are being deployed in the ductus arteriosus. In the primary operator is Dr. Masni Alvi from Malaysia, and they are investigating this particular stent on a small number of patients. One of the problem about this bioabsorbable, even an iron stent, is that it's extremely radiolucent. The radio opacity is not as good as the conventional cobalt chromium stents, the platinum iridium stents, and the stainless steel stents that we commonly use. These iron stents are very, very poorly visible, and hence they very often go by the balloon markers in order to position the stent. The problem about iron stents, if it protrudes significantly into the arch of the aorta or into the descending thoracic aorta, over a period of time they disintegrate, and the disintegrated broken parts of the stent may get embolized into the descending thoracic and abdominal aorta, and hence the investigators have taken a policy to not to cover the aortic end with an iron stent, and to, if there is an additional need for a stent, they will put in a conventional bare metal stent made up of a cobalt chromium on the aortic end of the stent as the second stent. This study is going on currently. It is made up of iron stent. The second stent that was studied long ago was magnesium stent way back in 1992 or 93 by Dietmar Schanz. However, it quickly fell out of vogue because of extremely rapid restenosis. So at present, the current bioabsorbable stent that is being practiced, that is being experimented, is the LifeTech iron stent. It's just molecular iron stent.
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
So, Madam has already covered this BT shunt recanalization. Just a technical tip will be, sometimes you may have to use an internal mammary artery catheter or a sharp Judkins right coronary catheter in order to hook the BT shunts in order to proceed further. And the moment you have gone in, if it is an acute BT shunt recanalization, it will be just wiring through and ballooning the entire length of the BT shunt, followed by a sustained anticoagulation in order to maintain the patency. One of the word of caution about this particular procedure, whenever you are doing the balloon dilatation, we have to remember that when we pull out the balloon may have a thrombus and it may go through the vertebral artery up and can cause a basilar artery stroke. And hence, we need to, whenever we are doing a BT shunt intervention in the acute state, we need to forewarn the possibility of an acute basilar artery stroke or an acute carotid artery stroke due to the thrombus migration. The second point that Madam Jyotsna was pointing out, sometimes the problem is not in the BT shunt, but the problem is in the anastomotic stricture. So this is an example of a tight subclavian artery anastomotic stricture, because a large graft is not able to be accommodated by a small subclavian artery, and in these cases we may have to sometimes dilate the subclavian artery in order to gain more lumen. Now coming to acute immediate post-op interventions in a tetralogy, it can sometimes be residual VSD or residual MAPCA. I will not touch MAPCA because Madam Vijayalakshmi already covered. They may present with a low cardiac output after surgery and may warrant immediate intervention. And sometimes with all the chest tubes, intubation, peritoneal dialysis catheter, urinary catheter, you may have to shift the patient into the cath lab. I'll show an example. This is the patient who had a tetralogy of Fallot surgical repair, and following the tetralogy surgical repair, there is a acute intraoperative transesophageal echo which shows a VSD closure. So the surgeon second time goes back on bypass and he sutures this patch again with multiple pledgeted sutures to the superior aortic annulus. He comes back again out of cardiopulmonary bypass, and again we are able to visualize a residual VSD. Now that immediately the moment we see such a residual VSD despite repeated re-interventions, that means the second cardiopulmonary bypass run, common thing that the surgeon does is they do what is called as an RA to PA step-up. RA to PA step-up is done by putting in two needles, one in the right atrium and one in the pulmonary artery. And if the step-up is less than 8 millimeter, the surgeons will say it is not an indication to go further and we can accept it. So this was a patient who had an RA to PA step-up of less than 8%. And so since the patient has already gone on 2 runs of cardiopulmonary bypass, there was an attempt to come off in a conservative manner. However, what happened? The patient comes to the ICU but remains extremely hypotensive. An echocardiogram is being done from the thoracic window, and we find that there is, and this is the interventricular gradient. So the surgeon says, the interventricular gradient is almost 3 meter plus, which is 40 millimeters of mercury. And so it is not going to be of great significance because the patient was at the time having a systolic blood pressure of only 70 millimeters of mercury. So 70 minus 40 is 30. So it is not extremely high RV pressures and PA pressure. So we will continue to follow this patient conservatively. So what we need to understand is that at the peak of the VSD gradient, actually the right ventricle is not contracting because there is a post-operative right bundle branch block. So the RV contractility starts much later. So at this particular point, it is the LV that is contracting. And when the LV is contracting, you are having a gradient of 40 millimeters. But when the RV also begins to contract, you have a gradient that is much, much lower. So in that particular patient who was having 70 systolic pressure, the RV predicted pressures were 62 millimeters of mercury. We need to understand in an acute post-operative VSD, where there is commonly a right bundle branch block, we need to see the late systolic gradient, not the early systolic gradient. So in this patient is moved with all the chest tubes. This is the mediastinal tube, this is the pleural tube, epigastric tube, intubation. We do the LV angiogram and we find that there is a large residual ventricular septal defect which is being closed by a muscular VSD occluder of 10 millimeters, and immediately there was an improvement in the entire hemodynamics. Sometimes, if there is an acute post-op VSD very close to the aortic annulus, they are common to be missed on echocardiography because the VSD will be abutting the aortic valve annulus, and in such cases, you may have to put in devices which are almost touching the aortic annulus. Sometimes the VSD patch dehiscence can be between the sutures multiple defects. So in multiple defects, then we may have to use multiple devices. All these are acute post-op residual VSD surgical closures. Now coming to
the holding of the devices, whatever the holding of these devices through these patches, because even this is also not stiff enough to hold it.
Yes.
So all these devices can be held?
Yes. Basically, what we need to know from the surgeon is whether he has taken a continuous suture or an interrupted suture. If the surgeon has taken a continuous suture for the entire VSD patch, then if there is a residual VSD, it is just a matter of time that the entire continuous sutures will unwound and the whole VSD patch will dehisce out. But it's common practice for congenital heart surgeons to use interrupted VSD surgical patch closures. And so what will be happening is only one or two sutures dehisce and not all the sutures. In those cases, the patch will be reasonably rigid and the device will be quite intact. They will not be very prone for embolization or dislodgement. But if the surgeon says that it was a continuous suture, it is always better to go back to surgical table and then revise the patch, this time with interrupted, pledgeted, firm sutures.
Okay.
Thank you. So now coming towards the last part of the talk, the late interventions, there can be late detection of residual VSD, pulmonary artery stenosis, conduit stenosis, residual MAPCA closure, but our prime target today will be pulmonary valve implantation. In order to know what is a pulmonary valve implantation, one of the common interventions previously done on pulmonary valve implantation were confined to the conduits. So you can see here, this is a calcified conduit, a calcified homograft conduit which is degenerating, and so there is a significant pulmonary regurgitation which is being implanted with a Melody valve. A Melody valve is a Cheatham platinum stent with a bovine jugular vein graft that is placed inside, and this will produce a competence of the pulmonary valve. Now, this is one of the oldest procedures. This has been there in clinical practice way back from mid-1990s from Philip Bonhoeffer. Now, during those days, in the initial days, if there is a conduit which is calcified, they used to just implant the Melody valve, hoping that the Melody valve will offer a permanent solution. But later they realized, whenever the conduit with the Melody valve was continuously moving against the sternum anteriorly, the continuous movements were producing lots of stent fractures, and these stent fractures were resulting in poor functioning of the valve, and hence the entire procedure got modified after the first 5 to 6 years in such a way that a conduit will first be pre-stented, And after the stenting, the Melody valve will be used to land within the pre-stent. So what are the indications to intervene in if there is a conduit stenosis? Any patient who is symptomatic, pulmonary stenosis with an RVSP more than 2/3 systemic, or if there is an RV systolic dysfunction. Sometimes it is done for pulmonary regurgitation. When will you do for pulmonary regurgitation? All symptomatic patients. If the pulmonary regurgitation fraction is more than 30% in an asymptomatic patient, if the end diastolic volume index is more than 150, end systolic volume is more than 80, LV ejection fraction drops to less than 55, RV ejection fraction drops to less than 47, and the RV is 2 times the volume of LV. There is also an electrical indicator. If the QRS is more than 180 milliseconds associated with a ventricular arrhythmia, this also will be an indication for pulmonary regurgitation. In order to understand the hemodynamics of postoperative PR, we need to understand this is the recent method of finding out how the heart behaves after beginning of a valvular regurgitation. In fact, the same format has been given for aortic regurgitation as well. So the 4 stages through which the patient goes, the first stage is compensated PR, where there is some amount of pulmonary regurgitation, but the RV does not dilate too much because the right ventricular hypertrophy prevents the RV dilatation, and the RV continues to have a good contractility. So this is the first stage, where there is neither a clinical impact, but only thing that will be appreciated will be a diastolic moment. Second stage will be a compensated PR with RV volume overload, but this RV volume overload has got an increased Stallings forces, so the contractility remains normal. Then goes to a third stage where there is a decompensated PR. The patient continues to remain asymptomatic, but the RV ejection fraction starts falling. RV fractionals, the fractional area change, the TAPC all start falling, but the patient continues to remain asymptomatic. The last stage is decompensated PR, where there is a symptomatic RV dysfunction. If we are going to be missing out the stage 3, the patients will keep worsening to stage 4, and we need to identify the stage 3 patients well in advance in order to prevent a late RV dysfunction, and that is the reason why a lot of MRI criteria are being given to pick up the patients who have got this asymptomatic RV dysfunction. Now, this is an example of a severe pulmonary regurgitation. You can see the pulmonary regurgitation Doppler. As it worsens, you can have severe right heart failure, tachycardia, hepatic congestion, elevated liver enzymes. And our intention is to pick up these patients far more earlier. One of the way of identifying a substantial PR is if you go deep into the hilar branch pulmonary arteries, if you find a pulmonary pan-diastolic flow reversal even in hilar pulmonary artery or post-hilar pulmonary artery, that is a significant pulmonary regurgitation. The valves that are available for pulmonary valve implantation in United States of America are the Melody valve, which is actually a Cheetham Platinum stent, the CP stent with a bovine jugular vein valve. The second one is Sapien valve. The Sapien valve is a cobalt chromium stent with a bovine pericardial patch. The third one, which we often use in India, is the venous valve, which is a nitinol wireframe. It's a self-expanding valve with a porcine pericardium stitched inside. A newer Indian valve called My valve is also there. It's exactly similar to the Sapien 3 valve with the same bovine pericardium.
Is the same as that of an aortic My valve?
Yeah, same, exactly the same. Aortic My valve is the same valve that is used in pulmonary position. The total Indian literature on pulmonary My valve is only in 8 patients till now. 3 in our center, 3 in Apollo Hospital, and 2 in Kerala. All the 8 patients are the only patients where My valve has been done. And so I'm going to be talking about valves that has been tested on much more larger number of patients. So this is an example of venous valve. This is the first valve that was done in our country. This was 2013. A severely narrowed conduit. You can appreciate the tight conduit narrowing here. And the conduit is initially stented. So after the pre-stenting, we can appreciate the free pulmonary regurgitation. The free pulmonary regurgitation causes a complete leak of the pulmonary artery blood back into the pulmonary artery, back into the right ventricle. However, the RVO stenosis is fully relieved. The third step will be putting in the pulmonary valve within the pre-stent And this is the rotational angiogram that is done after the pre-stented conduit. Pre-stented conduit has been valved. Now this is a venous valve that has been implanted, which is quite complete. So this is a pre-stented conduit. The world experience is much higher with Melody valve. Melody valve, so far 14,000 patients have been implanted throughout the world. I'll show one example of a Melody valve. A tetralogy with absent pulmonary valve syndrome gets a 22 millimeter pulmonary homograft conduit at the age of 7 years. It's a non-syndromic patient because cough with absent pulmonary valve syndrome is commonly associated with 22 kV. So this is a non-syndromic patient. The patient practices as a lawyer. Moderate conduit stenosis with 50 millimeter gradient and severe pulmonary regurgitation. Symptomatic. Regurgitant fraction is 45%. End-diastolic volumes are 190 ml. Ejection fraction is 44%. So multiple indications. Symptomatic. Regurgitation is a lot. The RV volumes are a lot. So you can appreciate here. This is the free pulmonary regurgitation. The catheter is rocking across, and this is the small conduit. You can appreciate the conduit here. And the moment the conduit is seen, the first step that we need to do will be to assess the coronary arteries, because the coronary arteries sometimes may be compressed when you are stenting this conduit. So with the left coronary artery catheter hooked into the LMCA, we position the balloon and we inflate the balloon.
One fundamental question here: you put the pigtail to take the angiogram.
Yes.
But pigtail has multiple holes. So
Yes.
assessment of the PR is going to be then effective?
It's not done for PR assessment, madam. It is done for measurement. So we are actually taking the measurement. So what we do is we freeze this frame and we take the measurements about, this is the narrowed conduit. So what is the length of the conduit? How much of length is needed for the conduit stent? What is the diameter here? How much of post dilatation we are doing? So the quantification of the PR is already done based on combinations of echocardiography and MRI. And our purpose is only to do the angiography to assess the length and diameter of the pre-stenting, followed by length and diameter of the pulmonary valve. So now we are now taking the coronary angiogram again. So this is in the lateral view. Then you go for a full inflation of the balloon. And while the balloon is fully inflated, the coronary should flow continuously. There are about 5 to 6% of the patients where the conduit may be sitting over the coronary artery, and the conduit balloon dilatation may compress the coronary artery, either left main coronary artery or LAD, and cause a narrowing. So it is very important to visualize. One more thing about this coronary angiogram: the moment we are occluding the right ventricular outflow tract, there is no forward cardiac output. So the blood actually stays in the aortic root. You can appreciate the aortic root, the blood is staying there. So the coronary arteries will be filled for a long period of time. And what we are appreciating here is what is the distance between the balloon and the coronary artery, because the stasis of dye in the coronary artery may give an impression as if the coronaries are occluded and it is a wedged injection into the coronary artery. So then the next step is the Melody valve is now taken. I mentioned earlier that always a Melody valve has to be put into a pre-stented conduit. Otherwise, the Cheetham Platinum stent will fracture. So instead, it is done by a hybrid manner. So what you do is, you are taking the Melody valve, and on the top of the Melody valve, you have actually taken an Andra stent. I will show it on a lateral view. See, this is the Melody valve. The black one is the Melody valve. And what is protruding on either side is the Andra stent. So you have mounted the Melody valve on the balloon, and on the top of it an Andra stent. So both are going together. So this is actually cutting short the procedure into one single step. So you are not doing a pre-stenting first and then taking the Melody valve. You are doing it both together. So then
you crimp the stent on this valve before itself?
Yes, the stent is mounted on the top of the valve, and the whole thing is taken within the ensemble delivery system. I will now show the previous picture. So here you can appreciate. I'll freeze it. Sorry. Are you still seeing the picture?
Yeah, we are able to. Now it is gone.
Yeah, sorry. Actually, Okay, you can appreciate the surrounding stent. It is taken together. When I try to stop it, it immediately goes out.
Yeah.
So here we can see that the stent is already mounted. Without a pre-stent, if you take a Melody valve, the Melody valve fractures very commonly. So then the second step is the inner balloon is inflated, and once the inner balloon is inflated, then we check whether the stent is in perfect position and the valve is in perfect position. And once it is perfect, then the second step, the outer balloon is dilated, and this is actually a big balloon within the Melody stent. So the outer balloon is dilated, and then again recheck the coronary, because I told 5 to 6% of the patients may have a coronary artery that is closely related to the stent, and if we don't recognize, these patients will have post-operative acute cardiac events, LV dysfunction, and it is very important to exclude a coronary artery compression. So the moment it is done, then the ensemble delivery system is slowly taken out. So this is the delivery system which is being taken out, and then we put in a pigtail catheter and make the final angiogram. So this is in an LAO cranial view. You are seeing the competent valve here, and this is a lateral view. Again, you are finding a competent valve. So Melody valve is the commonly used valve internationally, and as I told, it has been implanted in more than 14,000 patients. Whereas the next valve that has been used, which is Sapien valve, is less than 500. The third valve that has been used, venous valve, is less than 200. So most of the world's literature is based on Melody valve.
There is a question on the Melody valve.
Yes, madam.
Can it be implanted in the native RVOT?
No, actually, the native right ventricular outflow tract needs to be smaller than 22 millimeter for us to be able to achieve a Melody valve. And most of the pulmonary regurgitation, chronic pulmonary regurgitation, we target patients at the stage 3. You can see that the 4 stages. We target them at the stage 3, where there is a decompensated PR with asymptomatic RV dysfunction. At this particular stage, quite often the pulmonary annulus is much larger. But having said that, in the Europe, now people are quite aggressive. In a patient who is post-op tetralogy of Fallot, who is very, very young, even as early as 5 to 6 years, they address these patients with the Melody valve, so that even when the pulmonary annulus is less than 22 millimeter, they put in a valve inside. The advantage of that method is that they are giving a competent pulmonary valve very early in life. But the problem about is, each of these Melody valve has got a lifetime maximum of anywhere between 8 to 15 years. So there will be multiple reinterventions on these patients over a period of life. So our practice has been only in conduits, we practice Melody valve. If it is a native right ventricular outflow tract, we stick on to a self-expanding valve. So now coming to an example, which is actually Madam Jyotsna's patient. A patient who is having a pulmonary regurgitation, a chronic severe pulmonary regurgitation. Now when you are taking the catheter hemodynamics, here you are finding the pulmonary artery systolic pressure is almost 52 millimeters of mercury, and the pulmonary artery diastolic pressure is as low as 6 to 8 millimeters of mercury. This is, in other words, called as ventricularization of pulmonary artery pressure. If you carefully look at these traces, this is an indicator that the pulmonary artery and the right ventricle are almost having a similar pressure trace. If you look at the QRS complexes here, they are splintered and quite wide. The entire QRS complex is as wide as 200 milliseconds. So this is fitting into the electrical criteria as well. And when you pull back from the pulmonary artery into the right ventricle, you are finding a 10 millimeters of mercury gradient. The pulmonary artery pressure was 52 systolic and the right ventricle was 65 systolic, around 10 to 13 millimeter. The reason why the pulmonary artery pressure goes up is something similar to aortic regurgitation causing an elevation of aortic systolic pressure. Whenever there is a higher left ventricular stroke volume in an aortic regurgitation, the higher stroke volume produces high LV systolic pressure and high aortic systolic pressure. The same way, in a compensated pulmonary regurgitation, the pulmonary artery systolic pressure also goes up, and the pulmonary artery, the right ventricular systolic pressure also goes up. Now, what is more important here is, carefully looking at what is the end diastolic pressure. When we are looking at the end diastolic pressure, the EDP is elevated to almost as high as 12 millimeters of mercury. Actually, in certain frames, we are able to see that it is almost elevated up to 16 millimeters of mercury. So RVED is elevated, and correspondingly, RA pressure is also elevated. RA mean pressure is almost 9 millimeters of mercury, with RA waves touching almost 17 to 18 millimeters of mercury. This is the characteristics hemodynamic of a tetralogy of Fallot. High pulmonary artery systolic pressure and low pulmonary artery diastolic pressure causing ventricularization, RV EDP going high and RA mean pressure going high. Now when we do the echocardiogram shows a free pulmonary regurgitation, RV is dilated, secondary tricuspid regurgitation, and in general, in short axis views, RV will be much larger than the left ventricle. It's a common practice to do MRI. However, evolving technology shows that a 3D echocardiogram also may have an improving indications. So a 3D echo is done with either a GE platform or a Philips platform with appropriate softwares, and you can appreciate the enlarged right ventricle. You need to get a good quality image in order to find out what is the RV volumes. Most often the patients will not have a good echocardiographic window to target the entire right ventricle. This is an example that has been downloaded from the net, wherein there is a 3D echocardiography of a right ventricle. Very often we have never been able to achieve a perfect right ventricular entire volume determination using our 3D echo probes. So commonly we believe on MRI, but in MRI also there are two fallacies. They have realized that the standard method of doing an RV volumes is by multiple short axis slices. So this is from the apex, they keep on going towards the base and keep multiple slices, draw the volumes just like Simpson's method, like a modified Simpson's method, and then take the volumes. However, when it goes to the basal portions of the right ventricle where the tricuspid valve is being cut, very often the accuracy goes off. And so now it is a standard practice not to go by short axis slices, but by the conventional axial slices. So we have to understand that MRI also has got its own fallacies. Different MRI operators follow different methods, and so you may have different MRI volume numbers if you give the same patient to different operators. There is not too much of standardization on the MRI. If you leave behind these patients, the secondary tricuspid regurgitation happens due to tricuspid annular dilatation, and this causes severe TR as well. The purpose will be to implant this pulmonary valve across this right ventricular outflow tract. So the first step is doing a right ventricular outflow tract angiography with the marker pigtail, so that we will be able to assess what is the diameter of the main pulmonary artery and what is the length of the landing zone. And the second step will be understanding the hemodynamics. Once again, during this particular step, we can appreciate that the pulmonary artery is completely ventricularized. Then you do the right ventricular outflow tract angiogram in three orthogonal views. One is LAO-cranial, the second is lateral, and third is RAO-cranial. So this is a lateral view. So you take multiple measurements. We have to take the end systolic frame. You can see that there is a lot of pulsatility of the pulmonary artery. So it has to be an end systolic frame so that you take the maximum dimension of the pulmonary artery. The next one will be a balloon occlusion. So this is a compliant sizing balloon that is inflated. And again, you have to do the coronary angiogram to find that it is not getting compressed. The sizing balloon will very often jump out because of the free severe pulmonary regurgitation. You sometimes may have to freeze the frame where you have got the waist and then take the measurements. And the next step will be
in the process, in the procedure of the doing, sir. Can I ask now?
Yes, madam.
The one of the question is MRI criteria for implantation on a RV end systolic and diastolic EF is the same as what you mentioned as a 150 and EF of less than 47 is the same or the different?
Whatever I have told is all MRI criteria only.
MRI criteria.
MRI criteria. There has not been a complete correlation on echocardiography. Echocardiography remains highly experimental as of now because most of the patients will not have a very good echocardiographic window, and completely it is based on MRI criteria. If it is a symptomatic patient with pulmonary regurgitation, go ahead with pulmonary valve. But if it is an asymptomatic patient, the patient needs to satisfy the criteria of RV EDV, ESV, LV ejection fraction, RV ejection fraction, or RV to LV ratio. And the PR regurgitant fraction needs to be more than 30%. All are MRI criteria. Everything is MRI.
And there is another question by Dr. Chabra, that is, what is the outer balloon? You said that you want to inflate the outer balloon with the stent implantation.
It's the Melody valve is implanted using an ensemble delivery system, which has got a big balloon inside. Big balloon is balloon in balloon. So there is an inner balloon and there is an outer balloon. The big balloon is made by the NewMed company. Whenever the outer balloon is 22 millimeter, the inner balloon is 11 millimeter. Basically, inner balloon is half the diameter of outer balloon. So first the inner balloon is inflated, the valve is adjusted, and then the outer balloon is inflated. So in a 22 millimeter ensemble system, the inner balloon is 11 millimeter. And the way to identify which is the inner balloon and which is the outer balloon is, inner balloon is I is indigo. So the inner balloon's hub will be indigo color or dark blue color. The outer balloon is O is orange. So the hub of the outer balloon will be orange in color. So there will be a blue color hub and there will be a orange colored hub. The blue color hub is inner balloon and orange colored hub is outer balloon.
Yeah, and I think this is used in everywhere. The balloon in balloon is even the coarctation of the aorta. First we'll inflate the inner balloon to stabilize to the coarc segment, and then once we are certain that it is in position, then we'll inflate the outer balloon.
Exactly. Actually, the NewMed's big balloon has been bought over for Medtronic Melody valve. The principles are exactly the same.
Are the self-expandable pulmonary valves are there?
This is self-expanding, madam. What I am now showing is a self-expanding. Venous valve is a self-expanding valve. So now we are actually expanding the self-expanding valve. So the valve has been exposed starting from the left pulmonary artery down towards the right ventricular outflow tract. And the moment the entire valve has been opened out. So the first two valves that I mentioned, Melody valve and Sapien valve, are balloon expandable valves which are approved by US FDA, whereas the Indian My valve is an equivalent of a Sapien valve. And what I am talking now is the venous P valve, which is basically we have the largest experience with venous P valve in India. We have done about 28 patients in India so far on venous P valve, whereas Melody valve has been done on about 14 patients. Sapien valve has been done on about 2 patients, and My valve has been done on 7 patients. So more experience in India is with venous P valve. So this is a venous P valve. It's a nitinol wire frame with a porcine pericardial valve inside. So this is the valve has completely been deployed. And now you are doing a valve angiogram. You can appreciate the pulmonary valve competence. There is no pulmonary regurgitation at all. Now, what changes in the hemodynamics? Originally, this is the pulmonary artery pressure shown in orange and the RV pressure shown in yellow. And the pulmonary artery pressure was almost ventricularized. You can see that the pulmonary artery pressure, there is no diastolic gradient at all. The moment we put in the pulmonary valve, the diastolic pressure in the pulmonary artery goes up. So now, if you carefully see, there is a diastolic gradient. So this is the hallmark of a correction of pulmonary valve regurgitation by a competent valve. So this is pre-procedure where the right pulmonary artery is ventricularized, and post-procedure where the pulmonary artery is arterialized. So it has got a pressure trace like an artery. So this is the echocardiography transesophageal, wherein you see the valve and you are able to see the valve's competence. And so this is about pulmonary valve implantation. So just the last summarizing, what are the interventions that are done in tetralogy of Fallot? In the newborn period, you can have ductal stenting, RVOT stenting or RVOT balloon. Very rarely, if a tetralogy with pulmonary atresia is associated with massive epicollaterals causing torrential left right shunt and heart failure, you may have to go and close the MAPCAS in neonatal period. The preoperative stabilization is done in some of the patients who are extremely blue cyanotic with polycythemia and coagulopathy, wherein you may have to go and do an RVOT balloon or RVOT stenting, get the hypoxia relieved partially so that the patients become more stabilized. Or if there are large AP collaterals which are going to create problems for your cardiopulmonary bypass, you may have to stabilize them with AP closures. Sometimes they are done hybrid, intraoperatively. You sit along with the surgeon in the operative room and do a hybrid pulmonary artery stenting. There is a tight LPS stenosis, which the surgeon cannot do a PA plasty because the pulmonary artery is hardly 1 to 2 millimeter. You have to pass a guide wire through the main pulmonary artery into the LPA and put in a stent as a hybrid procedure. Or if there is an additional muscular VSD, you may have to do a hybrid VSD closure by perventricular puncture of the right ventricular free wall. Sometimes it will be immediate postoperative, wherein an acute residual VSD may have to be closed, an acute pulmonary artery narrowing may have to be stented, or a MAPCA may have to be closed. These are procedures. Sometimes this may be needed within the first 24 to 48 hours after the corrective surgery. Late post-op, 1 or 2 years later, you can have a patient who is having VSD device, residual VSD device, pulmonary artery stenosis being stented, conduits being stented, MAPCA being closed, and very, very late post-op, percutaneous pulmonary valve implantations or AICDs and pacemakers for patients who are developing arrhythmias. So with this, we will, this is just the last slide is just to summarize all the various types of interventions on tetralogy of Fallot.
One more thing, probably hybrid procedure, we can put it is the RVOT puncture of a pulmonary atretic valve and putting a stent.
Yeah, that, madam, since you gave me a talk of tetralogy of Fallot, so I did not include that. If the patient is having pulmonary atresia with intact ventricular septum with a membranous pulmonary atresia, that particular condition is applicable. The entire slide that I told is purely applicable to tetralogy of Fallot, which means there is a large subaortic overriding ventricular septal defect with pulmonary stenosis or pulmonary atresia. In TOF with pulmonary atresia, the atretic segment is long enough. So RVOT stenting of TOF pulmonary atresia is not quite a common condition. On the contrary, pulmonary atresia with intact ventricular septum is quite commonly addressed by the method that you are mentioning, madam, wherein either a puncture is done through the right ventricular free wall or a puncture is done through the main pulmonary artery. A wire is passed through the atretic pulmonary valve, and then you put in either a balloon or a stent.
Not about the pulmonary valve implantation. Previous component of presentation, there is a question from the CT surgeon. Do you prefer a perforation of the VSD patch or creating a PFO as a pop-off to the unload RV in an early post-op period?
Yes. The need for pop-off for the right ventricle is needed whenever the pulmonary arteries are extremely hypoplastic. So the McGoon index originally was proposed only for this purpose. A patient who is having a McGoon index of less than 1.2 is likely to have a postoperative RV pressure which is very high. And these patients are likely to have postoperative RV suprasystemic pressures causing acute RV failure. So these are the patients where we need to be prepared for creating a pop-off. So a careful analysis of the preoperative echocardiography, and if the McGoon index is less than 1.2, a better strategy can be allowing a better pulmonary artery growth, which can either be achieved by a surgeon by putting in a shunt or by the interventionist by putting in an RVOT balloon dilatation bar RVOT stenting to allow the PS to grow further. If the pulmonary arteries are grown and good enough for a McGoon index almost close to more than 1.5, these patients do not get into a problem of postoperative elevation of RV systolic pressure to suprasystemic levels. Now coming to what is a better pop-off? Is it a VSD patch perforation or whether it is an atrial septal perforation? Atrial septal perforation is by and large commonly practiced in every infant tetralogy repair. Infant tetralogy repairs are known to cause an acute restrictive RV physiology, and these patients postoperatively can have a low cardiac output with high systemic venous pressures or high right atrial pressures. And in these patients, if you have a pop-off in the PFO, they very often do well. So an infant tetralogy, it's a common practice to leave behind a PFO open. Right ventricular VSD patch perforation is confined to patients wherein your McGoon index was quite low, and in spite of that, you decided to go ahead with a corrective surgery, where a central VSD patch perforation to 4 to 6 millimeters can be made in order to keep a pop-off. There are some centers where, like for example, in All India Institute of Medical Sciences, they have put in a valved patch, wherein on one side of the patch, they will put additional pericardial membrane as a valve in order to keep only a right-left shunt and not to allow a left-right shunt. However, the patency of these patches and the creation of these patches are far more cumbersome. So it's common practice for the surgeons to leave behind a central VSD patch perforation if the McGoon index is less than 1.2, but still they want to do a total correction.
Yep. Really, I'm thankful to the Dr. Sivakumar and Dr. Vijayalakshmi Madam for an excellent presentation, and Dr. Lalitha along with me to chair these sessions. And we are so great that so many things which are not known is explained very well. And I hope it is helpful to all the students. Even the intervention fellows are joining these webinars. So I hope that it is helpful to everyone. Thank you all once again.